became a book of reference about the terrorist network. Bergen will be interviewed by Tora Bora, who is an editor at Morgenbladet and has been a journalist in international affairs for over 2 decades. So, please welcome him.
Thank you, Anna. I'll divide this talk into 3 parts, and according to, and then the first part will be about the decision making before the raid in Abbottabad that we all heard about May last year. The second part will be about the raid itself, and then the third part about the time after bin Laden. And I had initially thought that we would not open up for questions at the end, but there are so many highly qualified people in the audience here that will sort of burn with their questions, so I think we'll give them a few minutes at the end, a possibility to fit in where I have forgotten something essential. So if you take your microphone a little closer, I think the technician will be happy. And first of all, to start with, in August 2001, you had just finished your first book about Al-Qaeda. It was called Holy War. And you handed it over to your editor, and you meant to publish it in 2002, and then September 11th came. And the book was rewritten, and it was sort of brushed out on the market, and you became sort of a great expert on Al-Qaeda all over the place. But when and how did your interest in Al-Qaeda start?
Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me to this event, and I'm very grateful to everybody who's come here. I became interested in this, when I was 19, I went to Pakistan to make a documentary with two friends about the Afghan refugees that had left Afghanistan as a result of the Soviet invasion, and obviously made a big impression on me. And went back to Pakistan occasionally. And then in late February of 1993, the World Trade Center was attacked for the first time. And they put a bomb in the basement of the building. They killed 6 people. Their intention was to bring the building down. And the people who did that attack had one thing in common. They'd all been to Afghanistan or had helped the Afghan jihad against the Soviets. And I went to Afghanistan in the summer of 1993 to do a documentary about this, and we concluded that Afghanistan would be the source of terrorism and drugs. Unfortunately, that turned out to be true. And then in 1996, the State Department released some information about a guy called Osama bin Laden. And it seemed to me that the people who attacked the Trade Center the first time were an organization. And organizations have leaders, and bin Laden appeared to be a leader of some kind of movement. And I went to my bosses at CNN and I said, I think this guy, Osama bin Laden, who they'd never heard of, might be responsible for the Trade Center attack several years ago. And they said, well, that's interesting. Why don't you go and find out if we can meet with him?
And then you met with him together with war correspondent veteran Peter Arnett in 1997 in Afghanistan. How was that?
Unfortunately, I've forgotten all the details. It was, it was an interesting event. I mean, clearly, one of the reasons it took a decade to find bin Laden was these guys were very paranoid and secretive and disciplined when we met with them in '97. I spent a long time with a guy who's now in jail in London called Khalid Al-Fawaz, who was his media advisor, and there was a very long process to meet with him. And then a guy called Abu Musab al-Suri, who's now probably in jail in Syria, took us, and he then later I found out he presented himself very differently from the person he actually is. But they took us to meet with bin Laden, and that was in, obviously, the Taliban controlled Afghanistan at the time. And the night before we met him, another media advisor came to our hotel, and they looked at our equipment and said, we can't bring any of that equipment with us. They were very concerned about an electronic tracking device that might be in our equipment. They said, we will provide a camera, generator, don't bring anything, don't even bring a watch to the meeting. And the next evening, 3 heavily armed men and a van came. They drove us in the night time, and they drove us around to confuse us. And then we changed it into another vehicle, and we went up into the mountains. And it was March in Afghanistan, 6,000 feet, I think. And eventually Bin Laden showed up, and everybody in this audience knows more about Bin Laden than we did at the time. I wasn't entirely sure what he would look like.
Were you impressed in any way, or?
I mean, it was exciting. This whole event. I mean, I missed out the bits where we were searched. There was a lot of people with rocket-propelled grenades and Russian submachine guns, and there were concentric rings of security around Bin Laden, and they searched us and they swept us for an electronic tracking device. So it was exciting. It wasn't. That was my main kind of, and it was none of this we could film, obviously.
But he declared war on the U.S. in that interview. But the interview, when it was broadcasted, because you did get the tape that the Al Qaeda guys filmed, and you made a 1 hour long program about it, but it didn't make any fuss at the time.
It got very little attention. I mean, in I think the Associated Press, I mean, there's a kind of motto in journalism which is always be first, but first be second. I mean, because if you're too far ahead, no one, it doesn't mean anything. It's hard for people to process because it's an unknown person. It got some very minor attention in the Associated Press and some attention in the Middle East, but it basically didn't get much attention at the time.
But then came September 11th, and certainly your knowledge came into use. And when did you decide to write a book about the hunt and the death of Bin Laden?
Well, I decided to write a book about it on May 2nd, 2011, the day it happened. I mean, I had a book contract the next day. It wasn't a hard decision. It was a relatively easy book for me to write because I didn't need to do a lot of thinking about Al Qaeda or Bin Laden. I'd already written 3 books about it. Also, I've been living in Washington for 20 years, and I understand how to make things happen, I think.
And you interviewed a lot of people, but you didn't apparently get an interview with President Obama for the book. Was that disappointing?
Yeah, I mean, of course it was disappointing. I kept asking. Luckily, he had given a very interesting interview to 60 Minutes, and he also gave a very interesting interview to the History Channel. So he'd said enough on the record, so I don't feel like, wow, it was a huge missed opportunity. I'd still like to do an interview with him about it. Because I don't think it's fully, there's a very interesting moment. The final National Security Council meeting is on Thursday, April 28th, 2011. In which he gets very conflicting advice, and we can talk about that more.
Definitely.
But at the end of the day, at 7 p.m., President Obama would have to go back to his residence and basically, in the next 13 hours, make a very, very solitary decision. And I would love to have known in more detail exactly what he was thinking. And did he? I mean, he said that he did not talk it over with Michelle Obama. I find that kind of hard to believe, but.
We'll definitely come back to that. It's a very compelling story that you're telling, that you're writing. It reads like a thriller.
Thank you.
And you're a historian, so we'll have to go back a little bit when talking about this first part, the decision of doing the raid. The US forces, they were very close to capturing Bin Laden, apparently, back in December 2001 in the Battle of Tora Bora.
Yeah.
And what happened? Why couldn't they?
Well, as I write in the book, there were more journalists at the Battle of Tora Bora than American soldiers, and I think that sort of speaks for itself. In fact, you have a very precise number of American soldiers. There were about,
how many?
I think about 70, that included probably a dozen British Special Boat Service, which is special forces.
And this is before the Norwegian Special Forces came, so they weren't there apparently. But
when did they come?
I think they came around January 7, 2002. Anybody knows? Something like that.
Well, there were about 100 journalists at the Battle of Tora Bora, many of whom, a number of whom I know personally. And, you know, I asked them, you know, how many journalists, can you give me an assessment? And they said up to 100. So, you know, the fact is that CNN and the Washington Post and other news organizations were able to get their people to Tora Bora. So it wasn't that complicated. Mm. But at the time, you know, the US military, the last US military engagement was Kosovo, in which there had been 0 casualties. And it's hard to recall this, but the US military at the time was very risk averse. In fact, more journalists had been killed in Afghanistan at this point than American soldiers. Mm. So there was risk aversion, there was a worry that we don't want to repeat the mistakes of the Soviets. There was, in a way, the tactics they used had worked spectacularly to get rid of the Taliban. It was 300 US special forces and 100 CIA officers on the ground overthrew the Taliban in 3 weeks, along with a lot of help from the Afghan, you know, the Northern Alliance and the US Air Force. So, but those tactics didn't work at the Battle of Tora Bora. And bin Laden was definitely there. And as you know, WikiLeaks is a quite useful source of information about it didn't change my view very much about what happened at Tora Bora, but it gave it much more definition. Mm. So for instance, it is very clear to me that bin Laden left Tora Bora on December 11th, 12th, 2001. Mm-hmm. From the accounts that you have in the WikiLeaks summaries of interrogations of people in Guantanamo. And I've been to Tora Bora 2 times, and I've interviewed Afghans who were there and Americans who were there. There's a pretty good picture of what happened, we now know. And the interesting thing that is new is that after the Battle of Tora Bora, bin Laden didn't go into Pakistan, which is what you would expect. He actually went into Kunar in eastern Afghanistan, which was a very smart thing to do because people were not thinking that that was what he would be doing.
But then the tracks for him kind of evaporated.
They evaporated. We now know, and I didn't have this in time for my book, bin Laden's youngest wife, 29-year-old Amal from Yemen, who was interrogated by the Pakistani police and intelligence. And a summary of her interrogation shows that bin Laden arrived in Peshawar in western Pakistan in the fall of 2002. Mm-hmm. They then moved up into Swat, which is up in northern Pakistan, and then Haripur, and then finally Abbottabad. So now we know in more detail what he was doing. But of course, none of this was known to anybody except bin Laden and his immediate family.
When did they start getting clues about his whereabouts at CIA?
I mean, they had a lot of, you know, what they called Elvis sightings, which were not, you know, bin Laden's in Rio de Janeiro. They had to look at all these things, but they all turned out to be nothing. They had no information until August of 2010.
So 9 years after.
Yeah, nothing of any. They did, you know. There's a scene in the book where there's a relatively young female CIA analyst. In 2005, she wrote a memo saying, you know, essentially there was a recognition there's going to be no detainee that's going to tell us where bin Laden is. No detainee knows where bin Laden is. There's going to be no magic bullet. So how do we find bin Laden? And she wrote a memo saying there are 4 ways we will find him. 1 is communication with his immediate family. 2, communication with senior leaders in Al-Qaeda. 3, communication with the media, Al Jazeera in particular. And 4, just trying to look into his network of couriers. And the first 3 never really panned out. Nothing really came of that. And so it became the couriers. Now, at the same time that there was no information about bin Laden, there was information developing about Abu Ahmed al-Kuwaiti, who was the courier. Now, Abu Ahmed al-Kuwaiti means the father of Ahmed from Kuwait. This information that he was an important person in Al-Qaeda was derived from somebody who was going to be the 20th hijacker. The 20th hijacker was subjected to what I call coercive interrogation.
Torture?
I don't use the word torture in the book for the following reason. Torture, I think, has a very specific, conjures up a lot of different kind of images with people. I think it's kind of vague. No one can deny that these interrogation techniques were coercive. Some of them were more coercive than others. The 20th hijacker in fact, a federal judge appointed by Ronald Reagan said that the treatment that he had amounted to torture over time, and that he couldn't.
What kind of treatment was it?
He was kept up for many hours. He was stripped naked. He was subjected to music by Christina Aguilera at very loud volumes. He was forced to perform dog tricks. He was, he was basically kept up more or less continuously with, let's say, 3 or 4 hours sleep for about 43 days. I mean, he was definitely mistreated very badly.
But this led to information about the Kuwaiti.
It did, and this is what is interesting. It's hard to tell when he gave this information up. I couldn't sort it out from the information that exists out there publicly. But he did give information up about Kuwaiti. He said, and this is a very important part of the story, he was going to be the 20th hijacker. He was turned back at Orlando Airport because a customs officer was very smart. But he had been trained by the Kuwaiti about how to use the internet and how, in a sort of secret way, in Karachi. And he also, and the Kuwaiti, he said, was a friend of Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, who was the leader of the 9/11 operation in many ways. So this identification was important. This happened in 2002, 2003. In 2007, the father of Ahmed from Kuwait was identified as a particular Pakistani. He wasn't from Kuwait, he was actually Pakistani. He'd grown up in Kuwait, but his family's from Pakistan. And the Pakistanis, I wasn't able to definitely get this, but in 2007, the CIA learned his real name. And that was a big deal. However, Pakistan is a big country. It's twice the size of California. It's 180 million people. And his name is pretty common. It's Ibrahim Saeed, something. And then, so there are gaps in the story that I have that I can't tell you the answer to. But in 2010, this guy made a phone call to somebody in the Gulf. And the call was intercepted. It's not clear if they were listening to Ibrahim Saeed or they were listening to the guy that he was calling, or both. But they were able to identify this as, this guy appears to be in Al-Qaeda and he is in Peshawar, Pakistan. But again, it was still a long way from finding him because Peshawar, Pakistan is a city of several million people. And they had to put people on the ground to actually physically follow this guy or track him, put a tracking device on his car. So there were many, it took a very long time. And
then the Kuwaiti led them to this house.
Yes, the Kuwait, and then the 2.5 hours drive, the Kuwaiti led them to the house. And the Kuwaiti he was not only turning his cell phone off, he was taking the battery out at an hour's drive from where he lived. So then they arrived, then CIA sees this house. Now they expected that there would be another stage because the courier would be living in this house and then bin Laden would be somewhere else. But then it turned out as they began to look at it, well, maybe bin Laden is living here.
And we know now that he did, but there was nobody who was 100% sure among CIA analysts at the time or at any point before May 1st, 2011, that what they called the pacer at the compound where the Kuwaiti lived, they never knew for sure that it was actually Osama bin Laden who lived there.
Right. There was never a picture of Osama bin Laden. There was never a cook working at the compound who said, I just saw a 6'4" Arab guy, who looks like Osama bin Laden living in my house.
But kids lived there. How were they trained not to talk?
Well, the kids, I don't think bin Laden's kids were going out much, or maybe they went to the doctor. This was actually the CIA. There was people who were very skeptical of the CIA, and one of the people who were skeptical were saying, look, I mean, some of the kids who were living here were the kids of the bodyguards. They're traveling around Pakistan. They could easily sort of say something about this mysterious guy.
Exactly.
So, bin Laden appeared to be willing to take that risk. But he was living, I was the only outside observer to get inside the compound. And I didn't know that 2 weeks later they would demolish it. But that was, it was interesting to see how they lived. And it was, there were about 24 people living in this compound.
But CIA put up, they rented a house nearby, and they sort of followed the movements in and out of the house. They never got into the house with a camera or anything to really make sure that someone was there. And then President Obama got all this information, and from the CIA, it's sort of the certainty around bin Laden's presence there varied from down to 30-40% to 80-90%.
Yeah.
And on this background, President Obama was going to make a decision on whether or what to do with this information.
Yeah. I mean, it was interesting, some people were at 40% is there, and some were at 90%. But President Obama was either going to be 100% wrong or 100% right.
Exactly.
At the end of the day, the percentages gave a sort of false sense. And President Obama asks the deputy director of the CIA, why are some people at 40% and other people at 80%? And the deputy director of the CIA says, a lot of this is about the Iraqi weapons of mass destruction fiasco, which anybody who lived through that is very skeptical of circumstantial case. And then in one of the most interesting quotes in the book, he said, Mr. President, in terms of the data available, there was a better circumstantial case that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction than the circumstantial case that bin Laden is living in this compound in Abbottabad. Wow. And if I was the president, I would be, say, okay, well...
Yeah, too risky. When was Obama first introduced to this data?
August of 2010.
Okay.
This is a very long process. I was just doing an interview on the Norwegian radio just now, and it suddenly occurred to me. And what's very interesting about writing a book is you write a book and then you have to interpret it to other people, and sometimes obviously you try and put some analysis in the book, but sometimes it's not clear to you what's interesting. And in a way, this is a book about secrets. Obviously, bin Laden was keeping it very secret that he lived in Abbottabad, but also the White House and the CIA kept a secret for 10 months. And there's a saying in Washington, the way you keep a secret in Washington is you just don't tell anybody. And that is what they did. I mean, they didn't tell. There were probably a dozen people in the White House who knew. There were, they didn't tell anybody in the Pentagon. Maybe 2 or 3 people initially. The circle of people who knew was very, very small. Now, the more you got operational, the more you started thinking about what are we going to do, the more and more people begin to know, if not the whole story, parts of the story. And so even though I think this was an incredibly risky decision that President Obama made, the right decision, there were risks in doing nothing. Because the longer you did nothing, which of course is a very natural human tendency just to wait and see, the more likely it was to leak. And the intelligence picture never got any better. The CIA, as you said, there was CIA safe house in Abbottabad. They did things like count the amount of laundry on people's laundry lines to see how many women, how many men were living there. But they couldn't get a picture, and they couldn't get a definitive proof.
And then you mentioned this meeting at the White House, at the Situation Room on April 28. And 2 of the most important advisors in the closest circle around the president, Joe Biden, his vice president, and Robert Gates, the defense secretary at the time, they advised him against a raid with special forces in Abbottabad. And how come that Obama decided against these 2 really smart guys?
Well, that's a really good question. I mean, I think Liam, as I said, Liam Panetta, the CIA director, said in that meeting, what if a group of ordinary Americans were here and they knew what we knew? Wouldn't they say, let's just take the risk and do this? Hillary Clinton, who I interviewed on the record about this, gave a very long presentation. She's a lawyer, as you know, saying here are the upsides and here are the downsides. And no one knew where she was going to go. And in the end, she advocated for the raid. Admiral Mike Mullen, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, was very consistently in favor of the raid, which is interesting because usually Admiral Mike Mullen, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, would have a very similar view to Secretary of Defense Robert Gates. But they were in disagreement on this issue. So I think this was a very difficult decision. And I wrote my book, it came out May 1st in English, May 1st of this year. 5 days after it came out, Mitt Romney said any president would have made this decision, including Jimmy Carter. Well, I didn't know when I wrote the book that he would say that, but my book is is a long refutation of that idea.
Do you think Romney is right in that?
No, I mean, Romney is completely wrong. This is in the sense that it means on several levels. First of all, Jimmy Carter did make this type of decision, and it basically destroyed his presidency, or was one of the reasons he was a one-time president. If Joe Biden did run to be president, if it was President Biden, by his own account, he would not have made this decision. So the idea that anybody would make this decision is false. It's based on knowing the outcome.
But you describe Obama as a risk taker.
Yeah, I think he's a very kind of deliberate risk taker. I mean, thank you for reminding me. Because I forgot that. I mean, taking on Hillary Clinton was a huge risk.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, in a way it was a risk where, it was a very calculated risk, but to take on a woman who was, had all the money, had all the connections, and he was an outsider, I mean, that was a risk. Libya, look at Libya. I mean, he made that decision in 9 or so days. It took Bill Clinton 2 years to intervene in Bosnia, which I think is a not dissimilar type of decision. So this guy is a risk taker. I don't think he's a compulsive gambler or something, but I think that he takes risks.
Yeah.
And this is one of them. But I think it was a very deliberate risk. I mean, it took them 10 months to think about it.
There's another point you're making about Obama, and that we kind of ignored when he was here in Oslo receiving the Nobel Peace Prize, that his speech when he was here was actually a large defense for just war. And you also mentioned a speech that he gave in 2007 when he was still trying to get the candidacy for the Democrats.
Yeah.
And he was actually promoting or talking about making more attacks in Pakistan, and he was heavily criticized by Hillary Clinton and John McCain.
That's right.
And this
in
is
fact, Mitt Romney called him
POC.
Dr. Strangelove after that speech.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is,
he's not an anti-war president.
Not at all. In fact, he's been very aggressive. I mean, there are 6 times the number of drone strikes in Pakistan than under George W. Bush. He tripled the number of troops in Afghanistan. He intervened in Libya. There's an undeclared covert war in Yemen. 40 drone strikes roughly under
this
Obama.
week. Even there was a
yeah,
drone attack.
and only 1 drone attack under Bush. There's a kind of mini covert war going on in Somalia against the Al-Shabaab. So this is a guy who's very comfortable with the embrace of American hard power, and just because he was against Iraq doesn't mean that he's against war. So his speech in Oslo, it's incredibly well written, and it's a very eloquent defense of just war. And basically, I'm sure most people in the room are familiar with what he said. I mean, he said, while I admire Gandhi and Martin Luther King, that would not have stopped the Nazis. A sort of a non-aggression and pacifism, and you can't negotiate with Al-Qaeda. And in 2007, as you point out, he said, I would take a unilateral action in Pakistan if I had information about senior members of Al-Qaeda, for which he was greatly criticized.
So he was willing to use the special forces to raid the house in Abbottabad. And you're a historian, so I want to get back to the origins. You mentioned Jimmy Carter and the failed raid in 1979 in order to save the hostages in the U.S. Embassy in Tehran. And that led to the creation of the special forces in the U.S. Isn't that right?
Well, it led to the creation of Joint Special Operations Command, which is basically the group that did the raid. Special forces have been around before, but there's actually an important distinction, which I think is special forces is American term for soldiers who train foreign national armies, so that and there's white special forces, and then there's black special operating forces. This is U.S. Delta Force and U.S. Navy SEALs. And as a result of the fiasco in Iran, they created Joint Special Operations Command to sort of coordinate better. And one of the sort of people that I talk about in the book is General Stanley McChrystal, who basically turned this group into an incredibly effective killing machine in Iraq, who was responsible for finding Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, the leader of Al-Qaeda in Iraq, and So what happened, interestingly, before 9/11, the whole point of US Navy SEALs and Delta Force was sort of risk aversion in the Pentagon at the time, which is hard to recall. You know, Clinton said it would scare the shit out of Al-Qaeda if the black ninjas sort of descended on their camps. And this is before 9/11. Bill Clinton said this. And every time the US military came up with a plan, it looked like a mini invasion of Afghanistan. And so Clinton wanted, you know, a small surgical strike against bin Laden before 9/11, and they kept presenting these very large, politically impossible, you know, hundreds of people. So
Clinton wanted to use the special forces.
Clinton did. I mean, he, you know.
And they resisted. Was that because of the trauma after Somalia in 1993?
I think Somalia was a big part of it. Somalia was a big part of it, which involved, you know, U.S. Delta Force and other U.S. Special Forces.
And we remember this picture of an American soldier being dragged.
Yeah,
the body of a
that had a huge impact on people's thinking. And as I mentioned, you know, Kosovo was a big, you know, essentially had no casualty war, and that was the kind of framework.
So what happened, what led to the fact, you mentioned Stanley McChrystal, he obviously played a major role in making the Special Forces capable of such a raid that we saw in Abbottabad?
Yeah. What they did a number of things. First of all, they took their headquarters and they moved it out of the United States, and they didn't put it in Baghdad, they put it at Balad Air Force Base, which is an hour or so outside Baghdad. Then Stanley McChrystal brought in people from the CIA, from the National Security Agency, from all the intelligence. He basically kind of co-opted them, made them part of this. They also started taking, this is broadband internet is around, just becoming available. Just as Abu Musab al-Zarqawi used broadband video, you know, very effectively as a propaganda tool, the United States military started using a lot of this bandwidth for processing the vast amounts of intelligence they were picking up in these raids, and they would be able to pick up. They would do a raid, they'd pick up the intelligence, they'd sort of blast it all back to the United States, it would be translated, etc. And the same night they would do another raid based on the intelligence they gathered. And so this became a completely integrated military and intelligence operation. And in fact, Stanley McChrystal said, what we're doing is our fighting is to gain intelligence. So this is sort of, I think he had a framework, and he also said, we're not fighting a conventional army, we're fighting a network. So we have to become a network ourselves. We have to completely flatten the decision making. He's a very sort of democratic guy, and somebody that, you know, his men sort of love him.
But so even if the war in Iraq was disastrous in many ways, at least the special forces got some good training there.
They did, and in fact, you know, there are many reasons why the Iraq war, instead of, you know, why it started turning around in 2007, 2008. Which include previous ethnic cleansing, you know, the Sunni awakening in Anbar province and others, but Joint Special Operations Command inflicted a huge amount of damage on the leadership of Al-Qaeda in Iraq and also the Shia militias on the other side. And so I think when historians write about the Iraq War, this will be a very important component.
Apparently, Norwegian Special Forces have been training and operating together with the American Special Forces in Afghanistan. I guess people in the audience know more about that than I do. But we'll have to get back to the raid in Abbottabad. You provide quite a few details about the raid in your book, and then that was complemented this week with No Easy Day, the book written by Matt Bissonnette, who was there. And you reviewed this book for the Washington Post last week, so you read it, and it's a fairly dramatic raid. And your review of Bissonnette's book is quite positive. And so what is the essence of your review of his book? Is it a good book?
Well, I think it's a you know, the guy is the guy on the ground. He has no visibility on the military planning, in a sense, because there were other plans than the raid. He has no visibility on the president's decision-making process, and he has no visibility on the intelligence collection that made the raid possible. I mean, the raid is, in a sense, the cherry on the pudding. It's only for that his book is about 4 weeks. This took place over the 10 years. That said, I think the book is pretty well written, and I think it's quite accurate. And it is one person's account of what it's like to be on that raid, and that's why it was on #1 on Amazon. Weeks before it was published. So it's a subject of great interest.
They killed 4 men, apparently all of them unarmed, in this compound. Was that necessary?
Well, this is an interesting question because in the United States this is just like a non-issue. But it clearly is an issue here, and I remember I was interviewed by Spiegel in May in Hamburg, and it was definitely an issue in Germany. So it's helpful to have gone to the compound and looked at it myself, because I can kind of get a sense of what happened that night. And let me just walk through what happened that night, and then we can answer that question. Yeah. So the plan was that some Navy SEALs would drop onto bin Laden's bedroom, 3rd floor bedroom, and basically surprise him within about 90 seconds of arriving and kill him. The plan started going wrong immediately, because the first helicopter went down. The second helicopter that was supposed to drop these guys onto bin Laden's bedroom made the very good decision to basically fly outside the compound, because the whole thing would have if both helicopters went down, there's no mission. And so instead of killing bin Laden in the first 90 seconds as the plan was, the plan became the helicopter went down, obviously the people got out successfully, and then they encountered the courier, Abu Ahmed al-Kuwaiti. There was an exchange of fire with him. He was armed. He was armed? Yes, yeah. He was armed and he shot at them. They shot back at him. He was killed. They wounded his wife, who was living with him and their kids. They then went into the area where there's a three-floor residence where bin Laden lived. They killed a bodyguard, who was the brother of Ahmed al-Kuwaiti, and also his wife. Now, he had a gun in his room, but he didn't use it. Then they went up the stairs. They blew through a door, which I could see physically, a big metal door which was shut. They blew through it, and then they got to the 2nd floor. They killed Khalid bin Laden, who's 20. He was
Osama bin Laden's son.
Osama bin Laden's son. He had an AK-47, which he didn't use. And then they shot, and this is where my account differs from Bissonnet's account. I think Bissonnet's account may well be right, although bear in mind this happened on a moonless night where there's no electricity in the neighborhood, and the SEALs are wearing night vision goggles, and eyewitness accounts are often wrong, so that's with that caveat. So in Bissonnet's account, which I have no reason to disbelieve, bin Laden puts his head out his 3rd floor bedroom, and he shot immediately. In my account, he shot inside the bedroom. Either way, he's unarmed, and he's put up no resistance. He's had 15 minutes to think about it, because as soon as the helicopter crashes, he would have heard that's a very noisy event. And he has 2 guns in his room, which he doesn't use. Now, I think if bin Laden had surrendered conspicuously, not only on this raid, I think in any US military operation, it would be a war crime to kill him if he, under that circumstance. Now, he didn't conspicuously surrender. He had 15 minutes to do so, and he didn't. And they killed every military-age male who was there.
Would it have been also putting him on a trial could have meant a judicial problem for the American authorities as well? It was more convenient to have him killed.
Well, that's your interpretation of it, perhaps. I think a trial of bin Laden, as a historian or a journalist, I would find it quite interesting. There will be a trial of Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, the operational commander of 9/11.
Okay.
It will be a military tribunal at Guantanamo, the rules of which are better than they were initially, but it's still not a civilian trial, which is what the Obama administration wanted. They wanted a civilian trial in New York, but that became politically impossible. No, I think an Osama bin Laden trial would have been fascinating, but it's not going to happen.
Let's talk about the time after bin Laden. Firstly, the relationship between the US and Pakistan became quite complicated, and you're describing how Mike Mullen, who was the chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff, which is Forsvarssjef in Norwegian, and he had a very good relation with his Pakistani counterpart, General Kayani, who felt personally betrayed because they weren't informed about this raid.
Yeah, no, it was, I mean, the context of all this was the U.S.-Pakistan relations that were had never been worse, and this just added to that. Admiral Mike Mullen had visited Pakistan, I think, 27 times and met with Kiani. They really had a friendship, and the friendship is over, basically, as a result of what happened, because Kiani really felt, why didn't you tell me? But it's an interesting question. If they had been told, I think it politically would have been even more damaging to them.
Oh yeah, why?
Well, because then they, this was a violation of Pakistani's sovereignty.
They couldn't have accepted it.
Well, they knew, Kiani told associates, and I have it in the book, this was the worst week of my life, because what it said was the United States can just basically fly into our country undetected and leave. So what does that say about the Indians and what they could do and what does it say to the United States' ability to basically take on nuclear weapons, which is a very common view in Pakistan, that basically the United States has got plans to take their nuclear weapons. And it became very, very politically difficult for Kiani. And the fact is that Kiani had really reached out to the United States and he had a plan for a strategic partnership, so did the United States. There had been a lot of discussion of this. In 2009, when Ambassador Richard Holbrooke was alive, there was really a lot of momentum to kind of make this more than just a transactional relationship, to make it more of a partnership. And that all disappeared. But I think that Kiani would have been in a difficult position if he'd been told, because if it came out later that he knew and this was a violation of Pakistan's sovereignty, I think it would have been very hard politically.
You write in a book that the reactions in Islamabad meant, or it seemed as if nobody on a high level in Pakistan knew that bin Laden actually lived in Abbottabad.
Right.
Do you think any in the ISI, the Pakistani intelligence, or in the Pakistani police knew that he was there?
It's hard to prove negatives, but the answer, as far as I can tell, is no. And I had that assumption early on, because go back to my meeting with bin Laden. These are very disciplined, secretive guys. They didn't, why would they? Well, several things. First of all, Al-Qaeda tried to kill Musharraf, then the president, on two occasions in 2003. Al-Qaeda's been at war with the Pakistani state for a long time. Secondly, why would you tell anybody in Pakistan that you didn't? There were people living, one of the courier's wives didn't know that bin Laden was living there on the compound. She knew some strange guy was there, but she knew not to ask questions. So bin Laden was hiding from people living on his own compound. He had no reason to tell anybody in Pakistan, and there's no evidence. And by the way, the relations between the United States and Pakistan are not great, and if there was evidence, it would be released. And we now have thousands of documents from the compound. They've been translated. There's no smoking gun. So I don't see it.
Has the cooperation changed? Is it?
Well, as you know, they closed the NATO supply routes. This was after November, when NATO killed 24 Pakistani soldiers.
But now it's reopened, isn't it?
Now it's reopened. Finally, very, very, after 9 months, Secretary Clinton issued an apology, which I think they should have issued the apology, the day it happened. I mean, it doesn't cost you anything to say I'm sorry. Clearly it was a mistake, but Pakistan wanted an apology.
Yeah. Last night we heard Joe Biden saying that bin Laden is dead, General Motors is alive, or something like that, and he repeated this at the Democratic Convention.
I think it's true, right?
Yeah. And one of the Navy SEALs guys who took part in the raid, is quoted having said about Obama after the raid that we just got this guy re-elected. How important is the killing of bin Laden in the election campaign this fall?
Well, it remains to be seen how much they use it. I mean, I think that they haven't. I think they've been relatively restrained. They haven't constantly been talking about it. If you look at Reuters had an opinion poll in August. Obama has a 12-point advantage over Romney on national security. which used to be regarded as a Republican strength. Now it's really the Democrats have completely taken away this issue from them. So I think it's part of a larger story where Obama is regarded as, you know, strong on national security. Clearly, it's a very important part of that story. So yeah, I think it has a role to play. Although obviously the election is mostly about economics.
Yeah, national security is not always going to decide the outcome.
But it's interesting that the Democrats, you know, this is the first Democratic president, you know, in decades who's seen as, you know, really having a very strong national security strength.
And also it's strange because the first information that came out from the White House about the raid publicly was totally misleading. It was wrong.
Yeah, but that's very common. I mean, let me give you an example. When Oklahoma City was bombed in 1995, the first reports about that were completely wrong. You know, or when the Trade Center was bombed for the first time, you know, people, it was always, when a news story happens, the first accounts are usually wrong, right? But then, you know, add to this, it was a military operation in the middle of the night in a country 15,000 miles away, or 7,000 miles away. And it, you know, I mentioned there was a moonless night, no electricity, people are wearing night vision goggles. It's confusing. And so the initial reports were mostly wrong, but they were corrected within about 24 hours. So, you know, I just think that in any kind of, and one thing, by the way, one of the few things they didn't really fully prepare for the thing being completely successful.
Okay.
You know, they had a briefing book like this for all the things that could go wrong.
Yeah. And
so because it's really interesting, the planning they had for what one thing is, it was a covert secret operation. Now, they had a plan for, you go in, the SEALs don't find bin Laden, they leave, nothing goes wrong. People in Abbottabad notice there's something strange, but it's deniable. And the Pakistanis have good reason to sort of deny anything happened. And so one of the plans was just say nothing. They had a plan for, you know, they planned, they had a careful plan for, you know, something going wrong, which involved, they had to explain, one interesting thing is that they brought more people in on the communications side late in the game, because they had to, let's say things did go wrong, they still needed to explain, wait, we thought bin Laden was here, this is the case we had, we didn't find him, there have been SEALs who have been killed, it's been a disaster, but you know, we had this reason to believe that he was there. So they planned for every eventuality. The one thing they probably didn't plan for completely was total success. So, you know, people have been up all night, and, you know, I'm not defending the fact they got some facts wrong, but the point is that, you know, in a kind of very fluid news environment, there was a huge demand for information. You know,
well, we have some experience with facts coming out wrong in Norway as well after the terrorist attacks last year. I'll soon open up for questions, but I just want you to assess the threat from Al-Qaeda today.
I think it's very low. You know, and I have every professional reason to pretend otherwise because I've written 4 books about it. But I don't, you know, I think it's.
Well, you might be fed up with Al-Qaeda.
Well, you know.
Getting over to another topic.
Well, you know, Al-Qaeda, you know, it was losing the war of ideas in the Muslim world for a long time because they're killing mostly Muslim civilians. West Point has a really interesting, West Point, the U.S. military academy, does a lot of very good research, just like FFI here in Norway, on this issue. And it has a really interesting study. They looked at Arab language news accounts of terrorist attacks in the Arab world, and they found that the news accounts kept saying that all the victims are Muslim civilians. So this is widely known, and we know now from the documents that bin Laden himself was writing, and his colleagues were very, very concerned about what Al-Qaeda in Iraq had done to them. So, you know, Al-Qaeda has been losing the war of ideas for a long time. They played no role in the Arab Spring. The founder and leader is dead. Yeah.
But then there is an Al-Qaeda presence or affiliate presence in the most populous country in Africa, Nigeria, and also in Mali, where there is no state control whatsoever, and Al-Qaeda and cooperating Islamist organizations are in complete control at the moment. Isn't this a dangerous sign?
You know, I mean, I'm not sure if Boko Haram in Nigeria is really part of Al-Qaeda. And right now, yes, they attacked the United Nations building in Nigeria.
A year ago, yeah.
Yeah. But they've shown no ability or interest in attacking outside Nigeria. You know, Al-Shabaab in Somalia did try and kill Kurt Westergaard in Denmark, but they failed. These groups seem to be very focused on the local issues, except Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula and Yemen is clearly they're a threat, but is the threat really just one very skilled bomb maker that they have who's getting bombs onto planes? Or is it more? And my guess is these groups are going to be much more focused on local issues, partly as a matter of self-preservation. I mean, if you start having a global agenda of trying to attack the United States or the West, I mean, you're going to attract a lot of negative attention.
Questions? Anybody? Okay, go ahead. I don't think there's any microphone here, but...
I can repeat the question.
One thing is Al-Qaeda losing its grip, but does that, I mean, in Syria before the war broke out, we heard that there was a lot of very efficient killing of the people who were against the Muslim Brotherhood and political Islam, and so so even if Al-Qaeda goes down, the political Islam that wants to control and not be democratic, is that, do you think the danger of that goes down, or do you think it just finds another way? Or
Okay, yeah. So I mean, is political Islam a problem? In my view, no. I mean, I'm not somebody who believes in political Islam myself, but you know, political Islam, let's say the Muslim Brotherhood, I mean, engages in conventional politics, and it, by the way, is quite popular in many countries in the Muslim world. And if they arrive at power through the ballot box, as they have to some degree in Egypt, that's fine. I mean, I don't see the problem. I don't want to necessarily live in a society that's dominated by the Muslim Brotherhood, but I don't have to. And also, it's not my choice. So I think there's a big difference between Al-Qaeda. By the way, Al-Qaeda and the Muslim Brotherhood hate each other. Al-Qaeda is, Ayman al-Zawahiri, the leader of Al-Qaeda, has written a long book critiquing the Muslim Brotherhood. They're very opposed to Hamas precisely because these groups engage in conventional politics. So the fact that political Islam is doing well at the ballot box in some countries, to me that's a matter of no concern at all. It was in fact these countries that denied the ability for political Islam to have a political role in a way that created Al-Qaeda. I mean, because there was no democratic space in Egypt, the people involved in political Islamic movements often moved to become more radical. So I think if there's more space for these movements, we'll have less violence.
These views were shared by Thomas Hegelmer, one of the references in your book.
Yeah, well,
in an interview in Morgenbladet a few weeks ago.
He's one of the leading, I mean, if not the leading, sort of academic on jihadi movements.
Working at FFI here in Oslo. Anders Romarheim, one of our leading terrorist experts as well.
Thank you. Excellent talk and interesting questions. Two very quick ones. One, where do you see Al-Qaeda in 2020 with all the caveats you'd have to take, but where do they stand in 8 years? The second one, you're an expert on Al-Qaeda and particularly on bin Laden. What's your view of Ayman al-Zawahiri? What do you think of his leadership going forward for Al-Qaeda?
Well, I'll quote myself in the book. I say he's a black hole of charisma, so that's... and in fact, there's an argument for leaving him in place because he will manage what remains of Al-Qaeda into the ground, and by 2020 it'll be even less relevant than it is today. I think it's, Al-Qaeda has 4 strategic problems that get worse and worse with every passing year. They're killing Muslim civilians, which is widely understood in the Muslim world. They position themselves as a defender of Islam, yet many of their victims, and when I'm talking about Al-Qaeda, I'm talking also about allied groups like the Pakistani Taliban. They don't have a positive view of the future. I mean, if Bin Laden was here, he would talk about the restoration of the caliphate, by which he doesn't mean the restoration of the Ottoman Empire. He means Taliban-style regimes from Indonesia to Morocco. I don't think most Muslims want that. They made a world of enemies. There's not a single kind of institution, person or government they haven't said that they're opposed to. The UN, international media, Russia, China, India, every Middle Eastern government, Muslims who don't agree with them. The list goes on. And they won't engage in conventional politics, so they'll never turn themselves into Hamas or elite group. So I think I wish Al-Qaeda was a stock that I could have shorted several years ago, because I would have made a lot of money.
Okay, I think we'll have one more question.
Yes, so I'm working for a humanitarian organization without naming. From the statistics, we see that during the last year, the attacks on the humanitarian organization has been increasing. And I would like to know your reflections on that. What kind of link, if there is a link to Al-Qaeda and the whole thing. Your reflections on that, if it's possible. And by the way, thank you, very interesting.
Thank you. Well, I mean, I don't think, for Al-Qaeda and groups like it, they don't see humanitarian organizations. I mean, I think this has been developing for a long time. There used to be the idea that journalists were not going to be targets of, also the idea that United Nations workers, and there were certain types of people who could go to conflict zones and they would not be kidnapped or murdered. I think that idea has completely gone away, unfortunately. And so whether it's a humanitarian organization or a United Nations or a media organization in these kinds of conflicts, I think Al-Qaeda and groups like it regard them as simply, part of the enemy, which is unfortunate.
We have a question in the back from one of the Afghanistan experts at the Institute of, what do you call it in English? Of Defense Studies, yeah.
I just have a question. You've been talking about Al-Qaeda, but you haven't mentioned the Taliban. I would want to know the links between the Al-Qaeda leadership and the Taliban leadership.
Well, it's a very complicated question that require several hours, but I'll do it in very briefly.
Half a minute or something?
Half a minute. I mean, the Al-Qaeda, it depends, the Taliban is many different factions. The Afghan Taliban, which happens to be mostly located in Pakistan in terms of its headquarters in the south, has got very little relations with Al-Qaeda, even though they did give them sanctuary before 9/11. The Haqqani network in western Pakistan and eastern Afghanistan, I think, has closer links. The Pakistani Taliban, which is distinct from the Haqqani network and is based in Pakistan too, I think enjoys stronger links to Al-Qaeda. So I think it depends which faction of the Taliban you're talking about. But I will say, Bin Laden has now been dead for over a year, and Mullah Omar could have had the opportunity to say, my deal with Bin Laden was a bad idea, and he's dead, and it's over, and he still has yet to say anything on this issue. And the Afghan government and the international community want the Taliban to reject Al-Qaeda, and they want that to be, part of the deal. And this has not happened yet. And so it's just an interesting fact.
One last question.
Yeah, it's been great presentation, Bergen.
Thank you.
Two questions that are linked, actually. One is, as we look ahead into the future, there will definitely be new movements, new terror groups emerging. Two questions. Methodologically, which factors do you believe that people, analysts, researchers should look for when seeing groups emerge? And secondly, what factors do you think are critical to see when a group turns from civilian protest into militant violent movement?
Well, the one group that I know most, I think is a very interesting question. The group I know most about, Al-Qaeda, I think that the people's rhetoric is often linked to their actions. When people start saying, I'm planning to attack the United States, as they did in our interview for CNN, you should be, one should pay attention to that, because before action there's usually rhetoric. for a group. So I think it's very important. In a way, one of the points that's interesting to me is the Vietnam War was the first television war, and the first Gulf War was the first cable news war. And this is really the first sort of open source. Be looking at what are they saying. Some of it, of course, will be grandiose, but you know, if they're making certain kinds of threats, that's usually there will be action later. But you know, I don't see anybody with the capabilities and the intentions of Al Qaeda right now. You could imagine Lashkar-e-Taiba, but they still seem very focused on India. And one final observation, Yogi Berra, who's an American, I think, baseball player, said it's hard to make predictions, particularly about the future.
Yeah. I do recommend reading the book. It's like a thriller, and it's reality. And now it's becoming an HBO documentary, isn't that right?
That's right. Yeah, HBO is doing I think what will be a very good documentary.
Are you working with them on it, or?
Yeah, I'm one of the executive producer.
Okay. So we're looking forward to seeing that in a year's time or something like that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Peter Bergen, thank you so much for